If America's ever to add a 51st state, many Washington, D.C. residents think it's their turn. The push for D.C. to become an official state comes from a growing dissatisfaction relating to a lack of rights and representation in Congress. Washington residents pay more taxes per capita to the federal government than any other state. However, they have no representation in the U.S. Senate, which means that they have no voting members in Congress, which decides budget, laws, policies, and funding. Apart from paying taxes like everybody else, D.C. residents are American citizens. They serve in the military, they perform jury duties. However, the perceived lack of civil rights has led to a growing push for statehood. A series of aggrieved Washington license plates were released protesting taxation without representation. So how did all this come about, and how likely is D.C. to become the 51st state? It began when Washington, D.C. was founded in 1970 with the purpose of serving as the nation's capital. It was to serve as a federal district and not as a state, as all states were to be on the same level. The location was chosen to appease both the northern and southern states, with the idea being to choose a location that was both accessible as well as central. The city was named after George Washington. The name Columbia came from the feminized version of Christopher Columbus's name. Washington himself chose the location for the new district, which was created from land ceded by Virginia and Maryland along the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. Washington, D.C. was officially written into the American Constitution, which stated that the district, not exceeding the 10-mile square, would become the seat of the government of the United States, and so it came to be. Discontent amongst D.C. Washington residents began almost immediately. Most of the original inhabitants were former residents of Virginia and Maryland, where they had enjoyed congressional representation, but the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1801 gave Congress exclusive jurisdiction over the district's territory, which denied residents of their voting rights. In 1961, D.C. residents were finally awarded the right to vote in presidential elections. This has been the only significant voting power allowed to the people in the federal district, and most feel it's insufficient. Most recently, though, a push for statehood has thus gained some serious momentum. With a population of some 700,000 people, Washington, D.C. has more citizens than Vermont and Wyoming, and it's on par with the likes of Delaware and Alaska. Advocates for D.C. statehood argue that residents of the district have been denied millions of dollars of funding due to congressional control over D.C.'s budget. They claim that Congress has way too much say over how funding is allocated in the district, as well as interfering in local lawmaking and operations, and etc. This, they argue, would not be the case if the Capital District was a state. A classic case in point was the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Congress passed a stimulus bill that gave every U.S. state $1.25 billion in aid. However, Congress made an exception with the District of Columbia, claiming it was a territory and therefore provided D.C. with less than half of that funding. Another recent gripe was with the 2022 appropriations bill. This was set up so that senators from every state could request funding for specific projects. The federal budget allocated funding with no specific restrictions for this congressional spending, resulting in the most resourceful senators being able to secure huge sums to go directly to their respective states. A senator from Alabama managed to acquire a whopping $500 million in this allocated funding, while most other senators were able to secure the bulk of their desired funds. Unfortunately for D.C. residents, having zero representatives in the state meant that they could only watch on frustratedly from the sidelines. Now, what made this particularly hard to swallow was knowing that they still paid for their federal taxes in full, just like other Americans in the 50 states across the country. This growing discontent with the lack of rights and access to voting power has inevitably led to increasing demand for D.C. statehood. The question is, how likely is that to happen? That's a tough one to answer. Some think it's only a matter of time, whereas others think it'll never happen. Every state in the United States is spoken for in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Every state is permitted to have at least one member in the House of Representatives, no matter how small the population. Seats are allocated based on state populations, meaning that the most populous states like California, Texas, and Florida have the most members. As for the Senate, the Constitution dictates that it's composed of 2 senators from each state. Together, the House and the Senate form to make up the U.S. Congress, but because it's not a state, Washington, D.C. has no senators to represent in the Senate and just one delegate in the House. This delegate can sit in on committee meetings, but they're forbidden to vote on important bills, which the rest of the House can do. So what exactly how exactly can they become a state? Isn't it written into the Constitution as a territory? Well, those opposed to statehood are quick to point this out, maintaining that you can't just go and rewrite the Constitution. However, advocates for statehood have done their homework. They claim that all they gotta do is simply shrink the size of the federal district area. If the district can be reduced to the area comprising the White House, Capitol Hill, and the National Mall, then the remainder of the city can then become a new state. The next step is to have the Statehood bill passed. In 2021, President Biden gave the bill his blessing, and the D.C. Admission Act was passed in the House of Representatives. The final stage is for the bill to be passed in the Senate. That's simple, right? Not if you're a Republican. Republicans are seriously opposed to D.C. statehood because it would most likely be a Democratic state. And why should they give the enemy extra seats in Congress? Because that's how they should see them, enemies. And so, we have something of a stalemate situation, with most Democrats supporting D.C. statehood, while Republicans shake their heads saying, "I don't think so." In a number of polls conducted across the United States, the support for D.C. statehood has been lukewarm at best. In a 2022 poll, 41% of Americans polled said that they would support the move. 36% were against it, with the remaining 23% being undecided. Washington, D.C. residents also have competition. A similar push to Puerto Rico become the 51st state has been gaining momentum and is actually favored more by Americans, according to polls. A nationwide survey of over 1,000 American citizens found that 59% were in favor of Puerto Rico becoming a state. Puerto Rico is actually a territory of the United States, and its 3.2 million residents are U.S. citizens. As with Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico residents are subject to U.S. federal laws and lack voting representation in Congress. They're also denied the right to vote in the U.S. presidential elections, which would be granted should Puerto Rico become the 51st state. From a completely different point of view, if a 51st state is added, it brings with it some logistical nightmares concerning the American flag. First of all, the entire flag would have to be redesigned to fit that extra star. The flag is currently perfectly aligned, with alternating even and odd rows of stars. Every American flag outside of buildings, houses, and t-shirts and coffee cups would cease to be legitimate. The cost of replacing the flag would not only be massive, but is guaranteed to leave millions of people slightly peeved. And there's the name. If Washington, D.C. was to become a state, what would it be called? There's already a Washington state. It would most likely be called the Douglas Commonwealth in honor of Frederick Douglass, the social reformer and abolitionist. It also keeps the D.C. initials, which is very handy. Ironically, the push for Puerto Rico statehood could actually help D.C.'s cause because it may be easier to admit 2 new states instead of 1 to keep everyone appeased. And that's how it worked in 1959 when Alaska and Hawaii were added to the state list, becoming the 49th and 50th. Still, opponents of the D.C. statehood have pushed for the district to simply merge with the neighboring states, Virginia and Maryland. However, advocates argue D.C. population is larger than some other states and it would be a breach of civil rights. Washington, D.C. has a significant African-American population, with 46% of its residents being black. Supporters of statehood are promoting this statistic to the American people in the hope of garnering further support from non-Republican voters. Because basically, it all comes down to getting enough votes from the Senate. And it seems like that's going to take more pressure and support from the American public for the Senate to get behind D.C. and give it that green light. For now, though, statehood advocates are just going to have to roll up their sleeves and keep on grinding.